Good morning, everyone. Well, good mid-morning if you're out here in the East Coast of the world, out here in the Western Hemisphere where I am located, or a good time zone wherever you are. I hope you are well. This is Danny Haiphong. Um, it looks like we're going to go solo today. Uh, um, Hold on. I'm actually going to figure things out. You guys keep liking the stream, hitting that like button, the subscribe button, all of that good stuff. I'll be with you in a second. All right, everyone. So I'll be with you in a second. Keep liking the stream. I'll be right back. Hey, Kenny. We're live now, but I'm not sure if your internet is. Okay. Yeah, so what's up, everyone? Danny Haiphong for another Left Lens. We had some technical difficulties connecting with our guest today, Kenny Coyle, who's a journalist. He has lived in Asia, he has traveled across Asia, and he's covered Hong Kong pretty extensively. He's here now, but we may not be able to connect. So let me see if we can do so. Hi, Kenny. Has your situation improved at all?
Well, I'm still in the Philippines, so that depends on your definition of improved. But hopefully you can hear me.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Okay. So perhaps we can actually have this discussion as long as, before, unfortunately, the speech was cutting out, so I was a little worried, but we're live now. So perhaps we can give it a shot.
Okay.
All right. Well, good evening. I know it's late out there. So certainly, I really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to just give an introduction of who you are and your work? Because people may not be familiar. You wrote this really great article for Morning Star that I definitely want to get into with you. But yeah, if you want to just start out with introductions.
Okay. So my background is basically I'm British, Scottish. I come from a left-wing Communist Party background. I worked for the Morning Star for a few years. I've contributed to the Morning Star newspaper, which everybody should read, for many, many years. I've been based in Asia for just over 2 decades. I've lived in different places, Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, Philippines. Um, my interest in Hong Kong was obviously because I lived there, but also because, as someone from a British background and a British anti-imperialist background, Hong Kong became the kind of center for a while of the anti-China protests, the pressure being put on China by the West and by British imperialism, which has maybe much weaker than it was 100 years ago, but is actually still as dangerous as it ever was.
Hmm. No, definitely. Well, you wrote this article. I can pull it up actually, because I definitely want to get your take on the situation in Hong Kong. You had just traveled there, I understand, and then you wrote a piece for the Morning Star. I believe I have it up. Yes, here it is. Hong Kong, the truth is out, and you talk about you talk about Hong Kong in the context of its 25th anniversary of being returned to China in 1997. And there's a lot of hot debate in the West about this. And as you said, China has become, I mean, Hong Kong has become the center of this anti China imperial project led by the US, but of course, the UK is very much strongly involved. Could you talk about this article, what you saw when you were in Hong Kong versus what the media is saying, and what you think is important to take from it?
Okay. I didn't reference the specific article, but your American followers will be able to find a piece in the Washington Post written by a former Washington Post bureau journalist. I won't mention the name. This individual is currently working as a professor in one of the Hong Kong universities. And he wrote this incredible piece about how awful Hong Kong was, how terrible it was. And he was there. I watched him, partying it up in the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong the same week. There's just this incredible disconnect between what people are being told about Hong Kong and about China broadly, but let's stick to Hong Kong, and what's actually going on. I lived in Hong Kong for almost a decade. I went back because of the COVID situation and the riots as well. I hadn't been back in Hong Kong for about almost 3 years. So when I went back, what I found was a city that is by no means under some kind of draconian police curfew. It's true that the COVID restrictions are there; they're real. They're quite strict compared to anywhere else. But by and large, life goes on as normal, and that's the reality. Hong Kong is not the picture that we're given by CNN, by The Guardian, by The Washington Post, or The New York Times. It's a very functioning city.
Yeah, and you witnessed what happened in 2019. There were these relatively large opposition. They were called protests. You're calling them riots. The Western media called them protests, and they were quite violent, and they targeted public institutions and ordinary people in a lot of instances. You cited and referenced a particular experience because you were going back and forth between Macau, another special administration region in China, and Hong Kong. And you said that these so-called protesters or rioters were targeting the immigration center. Could you talk about that experience, what you saw, and what that was like, and what you know about the situation and its aftermath?
Yeah. Okay. So I was living in Macau, as you said. It's the other less talked about special administrative region of China. So it's kind of very similar to Hong Kong in the sense that it's the one country, two systems principle, which is applied. It's applied a little differently. But I was back in Hong Kong for purely bureaucratic reasons. I was going back. I had a medical checkup I needed to do. I needed to update my Hong Kong ID card, and I found myself. This was roughly it was a week before the riots happened, which really began on July 1st. So it was around the 22nd, 21st, 22nd of June, and this happened to coincide with me just handing in some documents to the immigration department. Nothing big. And there was this first attack on Hong Kong government institutions. The same day, the immigration department was targeted. The revenue, the tax office was also targeted. And this was the beginning, really, of a move away. And I want to be a bit. Let me clarify something. There were legitimate, peaceful protests, but they very, very quickly changed into riots. And I think that what I saw, what I experienced, was really the beginning of that shift. So it was a move from mass protests, regardless of whether those protests were correct or not, to very, very much more targeted and violent riots. So I feel that what I experienced was kind of somewhere in between. You could call it was non-violent direct action, but it pretty soon it became violent direct action. So there was a spectrum of what happened in Hong Kong, and yeah, I saw that change, and I could feel that change because I've been involved in some politics, some trade union activity before in Hong Kong. I went to the 2014 protests, the Occupy Hong Kong movement. Again, overwhelmingly peaceful, but this was different. There was a real shift in 2019.
And what explains that shift? Because I remember back when it was happening, and I think what is, I think, quite startling to the imperialists, to the United States, the UK, and its partners, is that these protests are basically, or these riots are basically no more. You write in your article that there's stability, that this isn't happening anymore, especially since the adoption of the national security law in 2020. But before we get into that, what were the character of these protests or riots? Because I remember covering this, that there was heavy influence from the West, that there were rioters who received funding, who part of organizations that had received funding from U.S. institutions, Western institutions, and that many of them were actually clamoring. You cited Nixie Lamb, who sits on the Legislative Council, where she mentioned, that Hong Kong doesn't want anyone who, to be influencing politics in the city, who is calling for sanctions on Hong Kong, which was quite a big demand for a lot of, at least the most prominent protesters and or rioters who are participating in 2019 in those activities. Could you talk about the character of these protests? Because I feel like that is often not spoken about at all in the New York Times or CNN or BBC.
Okay, so the specific protests began over an extradition bill. To give you some context, most countries have extradition laws, which means that if you've committed a crime in, let's say, in Toronto, and you escape to New York, then there'll be an extradition process. You will be arrested in New York, but you'll be handed back to the Canadian police. This is something that happens worldwide all the time. In Hong Kong, Hong Kong did not have extradition treaties with China, mainland China. That was the controversy. But the reality is, Hong Kong didn't have extradition treaties with Taiwan. It didn't have extradition treaties with Macau. I could have robbed every single casino in Macau. I could have got on a ferry to Hong Kong, which is an hour away, and I could not be charged under Hong Kong law with a billion heist. So there was a need to plug that gap. And unfortunately, the Hong Kong government handled it very badly. It was motivated to do it because of a terrible murder of a young woman in Taiwan, whose partner was in Hong Kong. They could not extradite him. The Taiwanese government made things very difficult, and the Hong Kong government quite correctly wanted to fix that problem. However, it very quickly was weaponized by the anti-China contingent in Hong Kong, who wanted to make this the idea that everybody in Hong Kong was in danger of being, taken away to China under these extradition treaties. So Hong Kong government handled it badly. The anti-China groups handled it brilliantly, and that was really the focus for the demonstrations in 2019. But very, very quickly, it moved well beyond that. So I think that the extradition treaty issue was weaponized. It was never really about the law itself. It was about trying to turn the Hong Kong population against China, and it was very much about involving American interests in Hong Kong and mobilizing them to impose sanctions and all sorts of other foreign policy issues against Hong Kong. And that happened very, very early, long before the violence. In April 2019, the main instigators of this movement were already in Washington. They were speaking in front of Marco Rubio's congressional committee. I've forgotten the name of it. And they were already pushing for sanctions against Hong Kong on behalf of the Trump administration. This is forgotten. They were really lobbying Trump. They met with Pence, they met with Pompeo, they met with Pelosi, the three Ps. Yep. They were all there, all done.
Yeah, and they successfully were able to pressure the Trump administration and Congress to support the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which did impose sanctions. And one of the interesting things about those sanctions that I remember quite well is that it placed potential sanctions, a presidential review on Hong Kong to investigate whether Hong Kong was violating U.S. sanctions against Iran and the DPRK. So I found that to be very interesting that was slid in there. And then I believe there was another a round of sanctions. I can't remember the act exactly, but I think it was a Hong Kong Autonomy Act. And I know that was just another round of potential sanctions. This kind of ominous, the U.S. will come down on Hong Kong if it's not sufficiently anti-China. And I feel like that was a lot of what this was all about, was to try to turn the city into kind of like a potential hotbed for separatism. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, excuse me. If you know, if you look at Chinese history, you'll know that there was a period in the 1800s, and Hong Kong is very much part of this, when Western powers created what were called treaty ports. That meant that foreign imperialist powers gained rights over particular cities on the coast, and not just Britain, Japan, France, all sorts of imperialist countries. And they began to have rights in China that were denied to the Chinese people themselves. So if you go to Shanghai, for example, today, you can still go to the place that's known as the French Concession. And it's a wonderful place, beautiful buildings, but that was imposed after the British had taken control of Hong Kong, and that was meant to allow French capitalists to be able to work in Shanghai without any reference to Chinese authorities. Okay, this was a pre-revolutionary period we're talking about. The act that you're talking about would have made Hong Kong a new treaty port. It would have allowed the small print is really interesting. It would have allowed the Americans to send State Department officials to Hong Kong to monitor everything that was going on. It would have allowed the United States to impose its unilateral sanctions, not just, I mean, Iran and Venezuela, I think, were the two, Iran, DPRK were the two countries mentioned, but can you imagine that Cuban cigars could not be imported into Hong Kong because the Americans said so? Venezuelan rum or oil couldn't be imported because the Americans said so. This is one of the most amazing. I'd recommend everybody have a look at it. Just look through the small print of what that meant, and you can understand why the Chinese had no time for this at all. This was an attempt to create a neo-colonial project in Hong Kong, and that's why things came to, well, they came to a head as they did in 2019, 2020. It's not just about what was going on in Hong Kong. It was the wider campaign by the US against China, and you have to understand it in that context.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the out and out support. I mean, this was direct U.S. support, both covertly and overtly. I mean, the fact that you had Joshua Wong and Nathan Law, these so-called opposition figures go to Congress, lobby for this legislation and succeed. I mean, it was always going to succeed. They're just kind of like the faces of it. And have also covertly their organizations receiving money from U.S. institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy. And then you have this wider campaign that you're talking about. You had the sanctions on China's tech industry, on Huawei. You had the ongoing propaganda about Xinjiang and the situation of the Uyghurs. You had the Trump administration sending warships through the Taiwan Straits. You just had, and through the South China Sea. You had the Trump administration passing acts, right, to move toward recognizing Taiwan as independent, the Taipei Act. You just had all of these escalations, and then, of course, the nonstop propaganda about COVID. So just nonstop escalations, and that, given that there was violence, right, there was, I don't know if you can get into some instances of the violence, but I remember that I think he was a custodial worker, was killed in Hong Kong. I know a lot of police actually faced brutality. Surprise, surprise, a little bit of a role reversal to what we usually experience here in the United States. And I know that there was a major university, the Polytechnic University, I think it was, that was used almost like a weapons depot. Could you talk about the violence, and then could you talk about the national security law that came in response to this? Because that was, I think, a huge moment where a lot of the propaganda especially came to a head, and the national security law was viewed as this very draconian measure employed by China.
Okay, I'm sorry, I lost quite a bit of that there. Unfortunately, I'm not in China. I'm in Philippines, which is a neo-colonial dependency, which doesn't have good internet connections. One of the bits I want to stress, though, here is this. You have to understand Hong Kong's politics on the basis of Chinese politics, not just simply the issue of foreign interference. By that, I mean this. Since, the entire breadth of the 20th century is about China's attempts to get rid of colonialism, to get rid of the imperialists. And there were really two forces which initially tried to do that. One was the what became the anti-communist Kuomintang, and the other was the Communist Party of China. Now, if you accept that you have communism, anti-communism, anti-imperialism, and you have imperialism, you begin to make sense of the politics of Hong Kong. If you view it purely, as unfortunately some people on the Western left did, if you view it purely as Hong Kong people against these Stalinist bureaucrats in Beijing, That's a major mistake. There's a long-standing history of conflict within Hong Kong, within the trade union movement, within the political parties. There's, if I can call it, there's a kind of domestic element to the conflict that needs to be understood. And then you have foreign intervention. And of course, foreign intervention, we think of the United States, primarily the NED, and so on. But we have to remember that the opposition groups, the anti-China groups, have been plugged into British establishment politics for 40, 50 years in some cases, long before Hong Kong returned to Chinese sovereignty. So this is a really interesting element, and it's missed out sometimes by anti-imperialists, and it's often missed out, well, it's deliberately missed out by others. But this is a really, really interesting part of the Hong Kong conundrum, because when you begin to understand that Hong Kong is a Chinese city, that it has always been a Chinese city, then looking at the broader issues of Chinese politics helps you understand Hong Kong politics. And I think some people on the left haven't quite got that, but it's a really important point.
Yeah. I mean, just even acknowledging Hong Kong as a Chinese city can be quite difficult for much of the left. But I think your point is good, because you write about something that's really interesting that I think is related in this article. You talk about how all of this, right, is blacked out of the Western media, and you're talking. You do mention this effort on the part of China in on the part of Hong Kong's administration to change the status of education, how people are educated about Hong Kong, because the West right now is sounding the alarm that there's kind of like an erasure going on, that the British rule over Hong Kong is being erased from memory and history. And you talk about how the proposed text from Hong Kong Education Department merely restate the long-standing positions of not only the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, which predated the revolution, but also that of the United Nations, that 1 year after the PRC took China's seat at the UN, the PRC successfully removed Hong Kong and Macau, then under Portuguese fascist administration, from the list of colonized territories. Hong Kong was not to be considered a British colony. It was a Chinese territory under illegal British occupation, an extremely important distinction in China's eyes. Could you talk about this kind of like reorientation? I'm guessing that this has intensified after the national security law was put into place and after the legislative, and maybe you could talk about that as well. What the national security law did, what the legislative council kind of reform that happened recently, what that is doing to boost and bolster these efforts to counter. I think this is a big counter to how Hong Kong is just even understood. Like, it's not a city that was just that is somehow was formerly Western owned and still rightfully should be dictated by the West, but it's a Chinese city. It's a Chinese city that was under illegal British occupation, a completely different distinction.
Okay, so yeah, this is a very complex one. So I could start by saying that some people have even said that what's happened since 2019 or 2020 is handover, 2.0, because the return to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 involved an amazing number of concessions, tolerations by China of Western influence in Hong Kong. So, for example, there are British judges sitting ruling on court cases in Hong Kong right now. Not just lawyers, I'm talking about judges. There are Australian and Canadian and all sorts of other Commonwealth legal experts employed in the Hong Kong legal system, because the Hong Kong legal system, part of the handover, one country, two systems, that means that there are foreign judges judging court cases in a Chinese territory. Now, I don't need to. Can you imagine the discussion that you would have in the US if there were Canadian judges on the Supreme Court, or even if they were involved in day-to-day administrative legal issues in the US? Can you imagine if there were Mexican judges doing it? It's absolutely impossible. And it's not just Hong Kong. In Macau, the legal system there is even more different. So it's what I call one country, three legal systems. In Macau, the legal system there is based on Portuguese law. So you have Portuguese judges. I'm talking about Portuguese-born, Portuguese passport holders judging cases. China bent over backwards to accommodate two things. One, foreign influence, but within certain limits. Now, those limits have been crossed. That's why China is acting. The second thing is, China also knew people within Hong Kong especially were not fans of the sea, regarded themselves as Chinese, as patriots. They were happy to see the end of British colonialism, but they wanted to maintain what they saw as specific freedoms or rights that existed. And for 23 years, China did not impose a national security law. Just imagine if in Hawaii there was no national security law, and anyone who moved into Hawaii, who lived there, worked there, wasn't covered by the national security and defense laws that apply to the rest of the United States. It's impossible. China did that. In Macau, the national security law was not applied until 10 years after the handover. So their handover was 1999. So for 10 years, they had no national security law. Then they applied it 2009. Not a single person has been charged under Macau's national security law. Not one person. It's not draconian. It's not unreasonable. It's what countries do. And if anything, I would say China was mistaken in not ensuring that a national security law would apply at the very, very beginning of Chinese sovereignty in 1997. If that had happened then, we wouldn't be having half of these debates. And the law that would have been passed in 97 would probably have been much milder than the one that has been passed recently.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. That's very interesting because I feel like the state of the Legislative Council before and then during these riots, right, kind of, because there wasn't that law into place, there was a lot of, I mean, it's just, respect. I feel like respect for the fact that Hong Kong was part of China was not enforced as heavily, and it allowed these anti-China groups and leaders to gain even more prominence. So that's very interesting. I mean, I think it's not very well understood how China is looked at as so draconian. But it seems like in this decolonization process, which is what this is, when we're talking about Hong Kong, China was very willing to accommodate Britain, the UK, and of course the US behind it in maintaining a pretty open. I mean, this is one thing you emphasize in your article, that Hong Kong's a very open kind of one country, two systems model. And it's only been just recently, because of this interference and because of all the damage that it did cause, that there's been a real significant change there. That's actually brought back stability to the city.
Yeah, look, I'd say my criticisms of China's handling of the return to sovereignty come from a very different perspective than the Western media. If you look through WikiLeaks, for example, if you go to discussions that were held in Hong Kong with the American consuls and one of the leaders of the protest movement, and he's called the grandfather of democracy, a guy called Martin Lee.
Yes.
He's literally sitting down with the American consul and he's reporting back on discussions he was having in Beijing. He's talking about Chinese foreign policy in relation to the DPRK. It's absolutely incredible. We don't have enough WikiLeaks information because it's from a very short period. But everything that you can, if you go on and you just search for Hong Kong documents, you'll see the extent to which so-called NGOs and so-called Democrats were working hand in glove with the Americans. Now, clearly, the Chinese knew that. They've known that since before 1997. This is not a revelation to them. But what was different is that in 2019, this kind of political program that they had became very overt and became very violent. And there's just nothing on record that says that these people supported the protests, but they drew the line at violence, which is why I said at the very beginning, we need to make a distinction. The protests were massive, no question. They weren't as big as they're sometimes presented in the West, but they were genuine mass protests. But the violence that connected with those protests
sorry, Kenny, we're losing you at that last. You said the violence connected with those protests, and then ironically, your audio went out. Okay, so just gonna let Kenny get back in here to finish that thought. How's it going, Kenny?
Hear me? Okay, so the quick point was distinction between mass protest, peaceful, and illegal, violent rioting is a distinction that's hugely important. Hugely important. There was a crossover, but the reality is that the protests were, I think, misdirected. I think they were misguided, but they were, by and large, very peaceful. A small minority, however, used the protests as some kind of camouflage to really mobilize violent attacks, not just on the police, attacks on individuals who didn't agree with them, attacks on the public transport system, attacks on businesses. This is right. It was targeted.
Kenny, unfortunately, you're breaking up. unfortunately.
Organization that had the smallest link to mainland China.
All right. Kenny, you were breaking up there. I think you were talking about the distinction. We left
Can
you
you hear me
at the
now?
distinction. Yes, I can hear you. Yes. But yeah, no, it feels like what you were saying, or at least what I was hearing, was that there is, that these anti-China forces that were rioting had very little connection to to the actual issues, that they were really just trying to divert these protests into an anti-China campaign. Is that correct?
I don't think they were diverting it into an anti-China campaign. I think the aim was always to create an anti-China campaign, and I think that the issue of the extradition treaty, which everybody forgot, because it was described as Western media describes them as pro-democracy riots, so pro-democracy protests. But that wasn't how it started. It started as a specific campaign against extradition, which is debatable. I think the Hong Kong government was right in principle, but I think they mishandled it very, very badly. But then these issues were taken by long-standing opponents of China. They used that, weaponized it, whatever other word you want to use. They took it and pushed it much further into a whole series of issues that had really nothing to do with the extradition issue. So they were waiting for an issue to come up. Extradition was a pretext, but
Right.
they were always there. There's always been an anti-China movement in Hong Kong, just as, and I'll emphasize this: there's a pro-China movement in Hong Kong.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
Well, let's talk about the situation now moving forward, maybe to close the interview portion of this program. You write about, I'm hoping to have Nixie Lamb on this program when we can arrange it, but she talks about in the article that you wrote, now that there's stability, now the Legislative Council, which has been reformed, is going to tackle some very important issues. And you also mention a real economic project that is part of China's a political and economic agenda, that there is a hope to really increase interconnectivity between the special administrative regions and cities in Guangdong province. Could you talk about what is to come from here in terms of issues that Hong Kong is going to address, as well as this larger project of integration?
Yeah. Okay. So my personal view, and it's up for people in Hong Kong to decide this, but I do think there's a need for political reform in Hong Kong. How that's done under the auspices of one country, two systems is not for foreigners to decide. But that'll be my first point. The second point is, Hong Kong is a capitalist city. It has all the problems of any capitalist city in New York or London or anywhere else, and there needs to be a way of addressing social inequality, housing questions, minimum wage, etc., etc. So we have to wait and see whether this new government in Hong Kong will be prepared to do that, because it's up against vested interests, and those vested interests are in Hong Kong. They're not in Beijing. So that's going to be interesting. Phenomenal Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong. It also involves Macau, which is the sister special administrative region. And it involves 9 major cities in Guangdong in southern China, all of which are, I mean, they're at the cutting edge of the world economy. So the idea is that there will be a growing integration of these living centers. Excuse me. And that this will become one of the major hubs in the world economy, not just the Chinese economy, but the world.
Unfortunately, Kenny, your audio is going out again. It kind of happened right after you sneezed or coughed. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but your audio did go out just as you were talking about the Greater Bay Area project.
So it will encompass, I think, something like 70 to 75 million people, each with different strengths. So Shenzhen, which is the city next to Hong Kong.
Unfortunately, we're losing you, Kenny, in terms of your audio. Sometimes turning off your camera can help, but you were just talking about this integration project, and we've basically missed most of that. But nonetheless, I'll give you some time to correct it. While you're all waiting, definitely like the stream. Continue to do that to boost the algorithm and share it.
Is described as the
right. I think there's some major lag here. Yeah. If you want to just finish your point, we're coming to the end. I hope that we can finish your point on this Greater Bay Area project. Folks, continue to stick around. This show will continue. Please do like the stream and all that good stuff. How are you doing, Kenny?
You take points. First is Hong Kong's future is in integration with the rest of China, and any force that opposes that integration or reintegration is a reactionary force. The progressive demands in Hong Kong should certainly be focused on raising living standards, but as a broader project, what's going to be happening in the Greater Bay Area is going to be the most amazing development in the world economy. It's going to be more important than the European Union. It's going to be more important than many countries in Africa or Latin America or Australia or any of these regions. This is a hugely important development, and it's completely missing from Western discussions about China's rise, I think. So it's something to keep your eye on, and I think that the new government in Hong Kong, at the very least, is very well aware that that is Hong Kong's future.
Right. Well, Kenny, it was really good for you to come today. I know that it's late out there. I know you have to travel. I also, definitely appreciate you explaining this very important development to the viewers here. Please do stick around, everyone. I'm going to stay on definitely, I think, for at least for another 40 minutes. But before I let you go, Kenny, could you tell people where people can find your work?
The best place is the Morning Star. So it's morningstaronline.com. Most of my writings are there. I don't really do other stuff apart from Friends of Socialist China, which I know you're involved in, Danny. Those are the two best places to get information, and there's some fabulous stuff on there, and I'm happy to contribute to both of them.
Well, thank you for contributing to Friends of Socialist China and for all of your work. And I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thanks so much for coming on. Everyone, stick around. All right. Bye, Kenny. Oh, he froze. Okay. All right. That was a great conversation. Technical difficulties notwithstanding, I think we were able to get a lot in despite the limitations. But yeah, please, let's boost this a little bit. Let's get this up a bit. The like ratio is great, but of course, sharing it also helps. If you're new here, definitely subscribe to the channel. And I am still several subscribers away from my goal of 500 by the end of this month. So please do subscribe and support this channel at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. That's how you make this channel sustainable. Patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. All right. Well, thanks for joining me on this Saturday. I do want to cover a couple of stories over the next half hour or so. And I feel like compelled, now that we're on this conversation about China. I think we covered Hong Kong pretty well there. And now let's talk about Taiwan again. And I know I talked about this briefly. I mentioned it in my last stream about the Squad and expanding NATO and how they don't talk about this and Pelosi's trip. But now the mainstream media, the Western media, is getting in on this, because the latest development with Taiwan is that, well, the Pentagon and Joe Biden himself is not happy with Nancy Pelosi, who it was leaked that she was planning, and she still is planning, to go to Taiwan at some unannounced date next month to visit with the government there. An incredible provocation that China's foreign ministry has come down really hard on. And there is some worry now, and both the Pentagon and Biden are warning Pelosi. So let's check this out. Let me show you what they're saying, and let's go to this Politico article, because Politico, I feel like they are at least the most concise about these issues, and I won't call them objective, but at the very least, I don't have to deal with some of the New York Times whining about some of this stuff. So Politico says there's a White House clash with Pelosi over Taiwan that's spilling out into the open. Pentagon officials are concerned that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, her planned trip to Taiwan could increase tensions with China. And this was written yesterday. So now there's an open dispute. I mean, this level of, I think, crisis within the political class in the United States, and with this crisis of legitimacy that's building up, couldn't get any more sharper when it comes to these kind of issues, because it's quite obvious that there would be no opposition to what Pelosi is doing if the situation with Ukraine was different, right? If the United States was doing better with that, if there wasn't an economic kind of meltdown happening across the Western world, and of course, if there weren't significant consequences to what they are planning to do, and what the Biden administration has been very active in, which is provoking China over Taiwan. This is Nancy Pelosi taking a step too far in a completely in a completely egregious manner with absolutely no, really what seems like no understanding, like a pretty stupid step too far. Like it's not even a really strategic in many ways for the US imperialists to do this, but there's division now because of that. So the Biden administration's dispute with Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, over her planned trip to Taiwan next month spilled into the public view this week when the president himself asserted that the military, quote, thinks it's not a good idea right now, end quote. Behind the scenes, White House and Defense Department officials have been quietly relaying the risks of a potential trip to Pelosi's office, according to 3 people with knowledge of the discussion. But since the news of the trip emerged on Tuesday, the president's public comments have ramped up pressure on the speaker to address those concerns. Inside the Pentagon, officials believe the trip could increase tensions with the region as Beijing ratchets up rhetoric and flexes its muscles in the South China Sea. Pelosi is planning to use military aircraft to fly to the island, which is standard for congressional delegations. But to the Chinese, it looks like a military operation, said one U.S. official, speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive topic. The military thinks it's not a good idea right now, President Joe Biden told reporters on Wednesday when asked about Pelosi's travel, but I don't know what the status of it is. Surprise, surprise, Joe Biden not knowing something. After initially declining to comment on Biden's remarks during her press conference on Thursday, Pelosi suggested the president's comments stemmed from the military being, quote, afraid our plane would get shot down or something like that by the Chinese, end quote. While not confirming the trip, she added that she has not heard that directly from Biden. Pelosi also pushed back on the notion that her trip would be interpreted by the Chinese as a provocation. Quote, it's important for us to show support for Taiwan, end quote, she said. None of us have ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide. As the Biden administration raises concerns about the trip, Republicans are backing up Pelosi, noting that she has a long track record of pushing back against China. I mean, do you hear this? This is really interesting. This is Nancy Pelosi being so arrogant, being so invested in the military industrial complex that she's willing to really set herself up for a military provocation with China over Taiwan and buck the Pentagon and Biden. That's incredible. That's something that doesn't really happen very often. Usually, these forces are walking in lockstep. So, Republican Representative Michael McCall of Texas says, I don't always agree with her, but on this one, I applaud it. So Nancy Pelosi is simply pleasing her Republican counterparts. It's important that we show up in Taiwan to demonstrate to China we are supportive. That's a very strong statement for the speaker to go to Taiwan. But Beijing on Thursday made an explicit threat to retaliate with forceful measures if Pelosi went ahead with the trip, which was initially planned in April, but was canceled after the speaker tested positive for COVID-19. Wang Wenbin, China's foreign ministry spokesperson, said if the U.S. insists on going its own way, China will take forceful measures to respond and counter it, and we will do what we say. Experts say the U.S. should take Chinese officials at their word. Well, no shit. Corey Shaki, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the Conservative American Enterprise Institute, said given all the factors in play, the Chinese may do more than just complain if Pelosi goes ahead with the trip, and that could be very consequential. Administration officials said I love the officials. Officials. I mean, usually that just means CIA, intelligence. All the anonymous folks are usually in the intelligence arena. Administration officials said officials provide the speaker with information and context that we believe is important for her before she travels overseas. She makes her own decisions. So she's been briefed basically by intelligence saying, this is probably dangerous, but do what you want. A spokesperson for Joint Chiefs of Staff's chair, General Mark Milley, declined to comment on her trip, but similarly noted that the general typically provides facts to decision makers. Colonel David Butler said, normally when the chairman briefs any decision maker, aka Pelosi, he discusses facts bearing on the problem, intelligence related to the mission, the logistics, and military requirements to conduct the mission. So what's so interesting about this is Pelosi is speaking out of one side of her mouth saying this isn't a military operation, this isn't a provocation, this is just showing support to Taiwan, while all of these military officials are saying, actually we're briefing her on military logistics, on intelligence, because why would you do that? Why would you have to do that? Of course, they say on any trip to another part of the world, they do this. But it seems like, given that they're talking about the potential of a military incident, that this is also taking, I think, more significance. So news of the planned visit comes as DoD officials are increasingly alarmed at the uptick of Chinese military aggression. Oh, God, here we go. In one incident, a Chinese fighter jet buzzed a U.S. Special Operations C-130 aircraft in June, Politico reported. In recent months, Chinese ships and warplanes have also harassed Australian and Canadian surveillance planes. So let me get this straight. It's Chinese aggression when they're in their own airspace, which Taiwan is part of it. There's no air defense identification zone, the ADIZ. That doesn't exist. That was created by the United States in World War II, and even includes Fujian province, which is a mainland Chinese province. So that doesn't exist. What this article is saying is that China is being aggressive because its airplanes and its military, its navy and its airplanes are sailing in its own seas and in its own airspace and harassing, supposedly, which I don't think is true, but is harassing Canadian and Australian weaponry, fighter jets, surveillance planes. I mean, this is absolutely just what we always see from the imperialists, how they project on to China what they are actually doing themselves. The U.S. Navy kicked off the world's largest, here we go, maritime exercises off the coast of Hawaii on June 29th. The Rim of the Pacific exercise, which will run through August 4th, involves 26 countries, dozens of warships and aircraft, and tens of thousands of personnel training together in and around Hawaii and Southern California. Biden is expected to speak to his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping by the end of this month, the U.S. president said Wednesday, but Shake argued that Beijing's increased aggression is in part due to Biden's loose statements about U.S. obligations to defend Taiwan in an event of an invasion. The president said three separate times has mistakenly said the U.S. has an obligation to defend Taiwan, stripping away the context of the one China policy. This potentially leaves the Taiwan, in a terrible place of us having a declaratory policy that the president won't back up with military force. So they just keep going and going and going, right? So it's not that Biden is doing this and it's aggressive and it's possibly a World War III, global confrontation. It's that he's not going to back it up. He's wishy-washy. He should just go all in and say that he's going to support Taiwan militarily. Republican lawmakers see Biden-Pelosi row, the Biden-Pelosi row, as an example of the White House's misguided fear-provoking an adversary. GOP lawmakers have slammed Biden for not sending more advanced weapons to Ukraine, for example, out of fear it would prompt a belligerent response from Russia. In a brief interview, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said it was important for Congress to pass a defense policy bill before the end of the year that meets the challenge of China's long-term threats to U.S. national security. So you see how this is always going? It's always about, we got to ramp up the China threat. We got to ramp up aggression right now with Taiwan because that's going to give us more money for the military. No criticism, said McConnell, of the speaker trying to make the trip. The real test is the defense policy bill and revising upward the request by the administration. That's the real message to the Chinese. So basically, who gives a crap about what Pelosi's doing? Mitch McConnell said, it doesn't matter. Let her get shot down in Chinese waters. Let it happen because we just want to pump the military industrial complex with more money. So Pelosi is not denying or confirming the trip in advance, being extremely vague, incredibly arrogant, obviously trying to save face here. And it just talks about how now the rest of it is just talking about how the U.S. has increased its support for Taiwan in recent years, with Biden and Trump increasing arms sales and sending top and current former officials to the island. In February, Biden sent a delegation of former senior defense and security officials to Taiwan, including former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Admiral Mike Mullen and Deputy National Security Advisor Megan O'Sullivan, and former Pentagon official, remember her, Michelle Flournoy. She was in the running for the Secretary of the DoD. So the president has accidentally or on purpose multiple times made it clear that we are committed to defending Taiwan against inappropriate actions by China, said Mark Montgomery, a former policy director for the Senate Armed Services Committee and retired Navy Rear Admiral, always from the military, always from the U.S. national security state It makes perfect sense that the Speaker of the House to visit there and see for herself. China should understand that the U.S. reserves the right to speak to look at this. This is insane. China should understand that the U.S. reserves the right to speak to its partners in a manner they see fit. This is how these imperialists think. They think that Taiwan is a partner. Taiwan is not a partner. Taiwan is an island that is part of China, which has been interfered in and manipulated and occupied and pumped full of weapons. And it is just blatant interference what the United States is doing. But yet, these hawks, these China hawks, want us to believe that China needs to understand that the U.S. reserves the right to speak to its partners in a manner it sees fit. That's dangerous. I mean, this is how dangerous this is becoming. The United States continues to ramp up on the Taiwan question. I believe some of this does have to do with the military budget that's going to increase by several billions. I forget what's the add-on. It's going to turn into what, 840 billion or something like that, from 813, something like that, like a massive increase. Congress is about to sign off on it. Biden is going to sign off on it. And I believe a lot of this has to do with that. And then also November is coming. And I do really think that the Democrats want to look tough on China. And that one of the few places where the United States can do that is over Taiwan. Because one, Taiwan already has so much for U.S. Military weaponry. It's already been stuffed to the brim with a U.S. interference in so many different ways, politically and militarily. And there has been a massive propaganda campaign by the Democrats included, but by the entire foreign policy establishment, talking about Taiwan and how China is the one being aggressive, when China is responding to a reality where the United States has already approved of, I believe it's 4 or 5 arms sales, something in that range, to Taiwan just since Biden has been in office. And that this has been complemented by, as the article said, delegations to Taiwan that former U.S. officials and current U.S. officials have been on. You had, even from the Trump side, you had Mark Esper recently there, the former Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump. So this is really dangerous. And China is responding to this danger because the more that the United States moves politically in this direction, with things like the Taipei Act, with all of these efforts to try to recognize Taiwan as an independent entity in international organizations, and now with this visit, a high-level official, the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States, going to meet with political officials in Taiwan, definitely gives off the impression that the United States is recognizing Taiwan as an independent entity. This is the folly of imperialism. They want us to believe that only words matter, right? That only their words and their optics matter. So here, the optics are, oh, well, the United States, they're just going to support Taiwan. It's just a trip. That Pelosi's just doing her due diligence. China's being aggressive. Taiwan is in this oppressive situation, supposedly, and in danger from Chinese aggression, quote unquote. It's China, the one that's being aggressive. So of course, the Speaker of the House should go there, should be diplomatic. They should support its partners. That's what you have these think tank China hawks saying. Now, this is why it's important to be critical of this anti-China policy, of this new Cold War, of U.S. aggression toward China. It's very important to be critical of it, because if we look at it with a critical lens, then we can actually discern what's happening. Actions speak louder than words, right? We were taught that at a very young age. I hope that actions can speak much louder than words. And here, to China and to anyone with a thinking brain, if Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or anyone goes to Taiwan, right, goes to Taiwan directly and speaks to them at a high level, that insinuates, that Taiwan is an independent entity, possibly an independent nation in the eyes of the United States. And it's a complete violation of the one China policy. Just like the United States' political officials in Hong Kong, to go back to Hong Kong, to invite those opposition figures who are already receiving covertly U.S. funds, UK, funding, all of that. They're already receiving that covertly, but they come to Congress and lobby for legislation. That's a complete violation of China's sovereignty. Imagine if China went to California, met with Gavin Newsom, and said, we need to lobby for more separation from the United States. It's not the equivalent, but it's close to it. It's close to what's happening. What happened with Hong Kong and now with Taiwan, right? It's very close to the same thing, except, and this is what we have to understand, and I want to push this point through. We have to understand that the relationship between the US and China is one of an imperialist aggressor going after and provoking and threatening and waging war against a country that has a long history of being an oppressed nation, of being a colonized nation, of being a nation that has been targeted by imperialism. So China here is not an equal aggressor or even a country of equal stature in terms of the system that it is developing. No, that is just absolutely false for anybody to think that. Because here, in every scenario, whether it's Hong Kong or Taiwan, China has given incredible concessions to the imperialists based on an uneven relationship and a world situation that demanded it, in order for China to survive and then thrive, as it is, right? In order for China to survive and then thrive, it could not allow for any kind of direct confrontation with the United States and the West. So it gave concessions. In 1997, many concessions around the question of getting back Hong Kong. You heard Kenny Coyle talk about Macau in the same way. And also, this applies to Taiwan. Taiwan is incredibly autonomous. It's not its own country, but its government has incredible autonomy. If it didn't, it wouldn't be able to get these arms sales, right? You would have PLA there in a snap of a fingers interrupting them. But China said we can't afford, nor do we think it's productive to have that kind of confrontation, that we should be cooperating, that we should be following the 3 joint communiques that started under Nixon and went onward into Carter, etc. We should really follow the One China Consensus of 1992, that we should be following the United Nations in 1972. People's Republic of China is China, has a seat at the United Nations, and Taiwan is part of China. That's what happened in 1972. 3 joint communiques later, the US and China came to what is pretty robust language about how to recognize the One China principle. And then in 1992, there was another consensus on that. So that's what China has done. China has given incredible autonomy within the framework of agreed upon principles, but the red line is Taiwan's perceived independence. If there are moves that even hint at the possibility that the United States is going to grant or try to grant independence to Taiwan and blatant interference and violation of the One China principle and China's sovereignty, then China is going to respond with force, with strength. That's the red line. And Pelosi here is crossing it. Pelosi is crossing it. And there's too many harebrained takes. There's too many people who've been propagandized about Taiwan that it becomes hard to even have a rational conversation about this. There's a lot of people who just think Taiwan is some kind of symbol of injustice versus the oppressor, right? It's some kind of symbol of some kind of national liberation, that there needs to be independence for Taiwan, completely ignoring the real history, completely ignoring everything that China has done and China's own status. It's this real anti-China belligerence, and it's become a kind of like a psychological disease, a disorder in many people's minds in the West, especially. But it's not even just reserved for the West, right? It's poisoning minds of young people in Taiwan, in Asia, in South Korea, in Japan. Right? This trend of trying to pry Taiwan from China is not just a it's not just a threat. It's not just a threat to a global war, to a war that nobody wants, that could end all of us, honestly. It's not just a prelude to that, but it also cements this view of China, which not only allows for that policy, which may be the most important one to continue, the most significant one, the most dangerous one, but also allows everything else to continue. The logic goes China is oppressive to Taiwan, which means China is oppressive, which means China deserves all of the things the United States and the West are doing toward China. And so that's the logic. And Taiwan is probably one of the biggest flashpoints there. So this is no joke. This is not something to ignore. This is not, if there's anything that the Russia special military operation should teach us, is that okay, this situation isn't the same, right? It's not the same. But one of the commonalities between Ukraine and Taiwan is that the United States has actually created a situation in both arenas which could lead to a broader confrontation. It's not that, Ukraine is suffering and Taiwan will suffer the same fate if we don't do anything about it. That's the mainstream media narrative, the Western media narrative. But the reality is that the overall implications of the conflict between the US and China over Taiwan are actually a lot grander and a lot more significant than many people think, and that the chance of a confrontation is much higher than many people think. And so we can't underestimate, again, the United States' aggressive, reckless policy toward any country. We can't underestimate. We have to stop underestimating how dangerous it is and what it could provoke should it cross the red lines that obviously other countries that are targeted by imperialism and have this long history of that are going to put down to protect sovereignty, right? China doesn't want this war. China has made it very clear. Nancy Pelosi is too arrogant. This just shows the political class, especially the Democrats, how they go about things, right? So arrogant, so elitist that she'll probably listen to the Pentagon. She'll probably listen at the end, but she's willing to go this far with it in order to appease a tough on China stance. This is midterm. I believe this is midterm election posturing, and I don't believe it's going to work. So that is the case with Taiwan. Okay. While you're still here, I'm going to stay on for another 12 minutes. I want to do a very quick coverage of something else that's happening. Actually, it's multiple things that are happening in one publication. The New York Times is actually cracking me up today, or I believe it was a couple days ago, where they go on in a bit. But keep liking the stream, sharing the stream before I get there. And please do subscribe at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong to support this journalism, to support this media work. About 8 subscribers away from 500. So please too. So Felix, I believe I kind of answered your question. Thank you so much for the super chat, though, and for coming back to view this program. Thanks so much, as always. Talking about what's the end game here with the Taiwan independence BS. I believe the end game is exactly what I was saying earlier, but surely I can address it later if it needs further clarification. But I want to talk to you all about the New York Times a couple of days ago. I was wondering what was going on here. Some people were trending, one of them about Trump voters. But there's like a series of op-eds on the 21st. I'm going to show you. It's kind of hilarious. There's obviously something going on. I mean, in every article, first of all, there's a lot of kind of down sentiment about Joe Biden, which I think is significant. So there's a lot of, it feels like discomfort with Joe Biden's administration for the obvious reasons that Joe Biden's administration is not doing too hot right now, right? Its approval rating is very low. But let's look at this for a second, and we're gonna just jump around. I don't want to read these articles, but if you do, you'll see what I'm talking about. What's hilarious. So Brett Stevens talked about how he was wrong about Trump voters. I was wrong about Trump voters, but look at this. There's a whole segment where these op-ed writers, the prominent New York Times op-ed writers, David Brooks, Paul Krugman, are talking about what they were wrong about. I find that hilarious. I just got a chuckle out of that. Because when you think about this, why would they do this? It's not satire. Read the articles. I read a few. I read this one. I don't want to go over it. It's just him talking about, oh, he doesn't hate Trump voters anymore. It's kind of like what a lot of people are saying about, if you demonize a whole voting bloc, you're probably not going to get them to, you probably make them more enthusiastic about the opponent, which is what happened to the Democrats. But, he talks about, if by now you don't find Donald Trump appalling, you're appalling. He said that during the Trump administration, Donald Trump's campaign. And so August 2015, he said that. But then he goes on to say how wrong he was and, why but this is a pattern, right? And then he goes on to say, well, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. That Abraham Lincoln said this. And he talks about how we need to be in the business of persuasion and win over Trump voters, right? It's ironic because a lot of people have been saying, well, you weren't even trying in 2016 to, it's not even winning over Trump voters, in my opinion. It's about just winning over any voters. And that's why Hillary Clinton lost. But you see here, look at this. You see here, I was wrong about Trump. And then you have Paul Krugman. I was wrong about inflation. So I'm not going to read these articles. It's way too long. But look, I was wrong about Al Franken. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. Me too. I think this will probably be a salvo about Al Franken. It seems like deserving some kind of ethics investigation. I guess she went against the Me Too thing. David Brooks, I was wrong about capitalism. So it's just on and on and on and on and on. I was wrong about this. I was wrong about that. I wonder why they would do this, right? I would wonder why. Look at this. Oh, Chinese censorship. Ooh, this is juicy. I didn't even see this one. Thomas Friedman, I was wrong about Chinese censorship. So there obviously was this whole coordinated campaign by the New York Times. It's obviously to show humility. It's a public relations stunt, but I find the timing incredibly interesting. Very, very interesting. So he said, I wrestle with since becoming a colonist in 1995 are if and when and how fast China will open up its information ecosystem to allow a much freer flow of uncensored news from both Chinese and foreign sources. I'm convinced I've been too optimistic. So obviously we know where he's going to go here. China is some kind of repressive country that's not allowing the United States and the West to basically dictate information there. He's going to talk about why it's bad that China opposes information warfare by the United States. But it's on and on and on. Gail Collins, I was wrong about Mitt Romney and his dog. Could you guess where this is probably going? Probably she's going to say that she should have been less harsh to Mitt Romney. So this is what's crazy. That she is talking about if you don't agree with that, but the one lesson I take away from my CMIS period is that there are some things that are way worse than boring. So basically she's saying my opposition to Mitt Romney was probably the reason why Trump got in. There is this is like a propaganda campaign, like an open propaganda campaign. I was wrong about X in order to strengthen imperialism, Thomas Friedman. I was wrong about Mitt Romney because he's better than Trump, right? So Democrats should be Republicans. I mean, this is just, I was just, I was just taken aback. All I wanted to do was scour the news, see if there was anything interesting to expound upon. And this whole campaign, the New York Times trying to be humble here, supposedly, but it's obviously an agenda. Mitt Romney, Trump voters, capitalism, inflation. What do all these issues have in common? It's all issues where the New York Times and the Democratic Party are doing incredibly poorly on right now. One, the political right views the right wing, which is what the Democrats want, who they want to talk to. They think the U.S. is soft on China. There you got Thomas Friedman. The Democratic Party wants to align more with mainstream GOP Republicans who are supposedly anti-Trump. So you got Mitt Romney here. The Democrats are desperate to not lose their majority in Congress, their very slight majority. So they're going to go for Trump voters. Capitalism, I can only imagine this is a sad play at trying to appeal to Democratic Party voters who are increasingly critical of capitalism. And then, the Me Too stuff not being hard enough on Me Too, right? Not being hard enough in support of Me Too, right? This is all electoral posturing. The New York Times is a political rag. At this point, we're just seeing the New York Times act as a political rag. It is literally holding kind of like a tribunal, like an opinion column tribunal, an opinion editor tribunal, to try to rectify all of the mistakes that they perceive that they've made, a lot of which only point to moving the New York Times and their readers further to the right on China, on capitalism, on Me Too, et cetera, right? This is not being humble. This is just extreme propaganda. This is just propaganda to the highest degree, in order to make us believe that, well, the New York Times has any credibility, which it doesn't. I mean, the New York Times is not read by anyone outside of a very elite circle, or at least it's not read with the a purpose of ingesting, purchasing, right? I think people do look at the Times. I know a lot of leftists look at the Times to see what's going on. But certainly those who are critical of the New York Times are a very elite circle for the most part. And then there's a lot of people who just ignore it, right? A lot of people just ignore the media at this point, don't have any trust in it. And should we not see why? I mean, how could we have trust in an institution that's doing that? I mean, that's just pathetic, and it's also dangerous, right? Because it's turning, right, this whole idea of opinion making on its head. We're sorry for our opinions that we believe are wrong in some instances, because we need to have a diversity of opinions. At the end of every article, it's like, we need to have a diversity of opinions. Well, actually, what you're saying is that there are opinions that are incorrect, and that this diversity of opinions you say you have is really just about appeasing and appealing to certain forces for political purposes. That the purpose of this is political, that it is probably, most likely, if not a guarantee, it's all about the elections coming up, in my opinion. It's all about November, this fear of losing the majority, this fear of being, once again, outsiders, while at the same time probably realizing that the Democratic Party wants to be the outsiders in a lot of ways. They don't want to be a majority. And so there's this tension, right? There's this tension of it's all about legitimacy. That tension really has very little to do with the outcomes of these things, and more to do with what the outcomes say about the legitimacy of their system. These are rich people, capitalists, corporatists, imperialists, who are looking at their just completely unearned wealth and all of the power that they've been able to usurp. And they're looking at it and saying, man, there are certain scenarios that are going to endanger this in the future. And that's what the New York Times is doing here, looking at all of the monopolization, the concentration of the information space, and saying, all right, there's some political outcomes, developments that could very well worsen our stock. And it's not as if the New York Times has not been through the ringer, at least when it comes to its legitimacy. People just don't trust periodicals like the New York Times. Most people see it as political, and most people see the New York Times as having an agenda. an agenda that doesn't serve them for the most part. And this is kind of something that is felt across the political spectrum, from the most apathetic to those who are the most hard right to those who are on the left. There is this feeling that is swing because ideology, right, is lags behind the conditions of our time. The conditions of our times, as the New York Times, is a political rag serving corporate interests and imperialist interests, while ideology, there isn't a coherent one in opposition. So there are folks who have all kinds of ideological worldviews, and they tend to agree on one thing, which is that the New York Times is more and more illegitimate, and that the mainstream media as a whole, the Western, US-led mainstream media, is more and more illegitimate. So with that said, everyone, I think it's time to close up this stream. It's about getting to 90 minutes. Thanks so much for coming out. Before you go, of course, like this, share the playback. It will be up for people to view, so you should definitely share it wherever you can, so it gets more views, gets more likes. Share it on your Telegram channels that have groups. Share it on Twitter. Share it anywhere, Facebook, wherever you do social media. Tomorrow I'm going to try to do a call in, if not another stream. I don't know. I have a lot of chores to do around the house, but I'm going to try to do maybe another stream and or a call in. We'll see how that goes. But also, please do subscribe on Patreon or on Substack or in wherever you can in the description of this video. Patreon and Substack, of course, I prioritize. That's how you help keep this channel sustainable. I'm still working to try to keep and maintain the financial goal that I have met, but I already have had a pretty, a lot of people coming to me saying it's hard times. So I understand it's hard times. I'm definitely not forcing anyone or trying to impose on anyone. But for anyone who does respect this work and who does feel like they can, please do subscribe on Patreon and or Substack to help continue it. All right, everyone. With that said, salute. I'll be back again, probably sometime soon. And someone's saying, do I have a P.O. box? How about you message me, Anthony? Message me on wherever you have me on my platforms. You all should have my email somewhere, I hope. But message me on Twitter or you can find a way to communicate with me. Also, let me just put my email. If you guys have like personal direct questions, I'll just put my email in the chat. All right, because I know some of you all have other ways that you want to support. So I'm putting my email in the chat for you, Anthony, for anyone else who wants to get in touch that way. Happy Saturday, everyone. I'll be back again soon, and I'll let you know, okay? So take care. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Peace out.